Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening, goeienaand and shalom. Welcome to another episode of the Big Daddy Liberty Show. That's right, it is the BDL Show. You know what time it is, 7 p.m. on a Wednesday evening. If you've missed me for a while, it is Yontiv at the moment. Quite a few religious holidays that I'm observing, so I'm not posting content as regularly as I am. That being said, I'm happy to be back here with you tonight. If you live in Umlazi and you see a shack in the front of a shack, of course, in the front of my yard, do not be surprised. And no, it is not a shack either. But I'll explain all of that much later because there's something much more interesting. Oh no, actually no. Let me take a step back. Something somewhat interesting, which I think you'll love, that we're going to discuss and debate tonight. It is a debate that is raging at the moment around the world, not just in South Africa, but around the world. And in some places, we're seeing mass protests against this particular issue and topic. What am I talking about? Why am I being so cryptic? I'm talking, of course, about the proposed and rather mooted, I'm right, vaccine mandates and or passports that are being proposed by politicians around the world as we grapple with and tackle COVID-19, which on this show, I've always said, is we're not anti-believers in inverted commas to the virus. The virus clearly exists. I've proven that much on the show myself, having had it myself. That is the SARS-CoV-2 variant of this virus, which has found itself becoming rather the pandemic by way of COVID-19. Now, with that being said, it is the response to this virus which is the focus of this discussion. One such response is seen in the context of the ongoing lockdowns that governments around the world have initiated and are persisting with in most parts of the world. Lockdowns which have seen, of course, governments often feigning to be liberal democracies, appropriating for themselves powers that they've never had before, unprecedented amounts of power that has concentrated itself into a political elite. And part of that has been all sorts of weird things we've been told we can and can't do. You can go here, you can't go here. You can eat a warm pie, but not a hot chicken. You can wear an open-toe shoe, but not a tank top or a wife beater. All of these things we've come to, and we're seeing, especially in the mainstream media, a beginning to a normalizing, if you will, of these sort of state diktats, even despite folks like me and many others, including this entire panel, by the way, of liberals to classical liberals to libertarians who have raised their concerns on this issue. But the one area we're going to zoom in on for tonight's debate purposes is a feature, I suppose, of lockdowns, a rather novel feature of it, which is the proposal of politicians having the power to either A, mandate an individual getting a COVID-19 vaccine shot, or the jab, as it's often referred to, or alternatively, another means, it's almost a stick in the carrot to an extent, but both seeing the state at the center of mandating it is the vaccine passport, of course, which some may argue is the carrot side of the state intervention. But let me not waffle about it. I've brought a panel here of fellows who are more than capable to have this issue out. In fact, they've written on it, and a lot of you have seen their writing. Some of you were very angry, and others were in favor of the various authors. Let me bring them on in a moment, except to remind you, as I always do, if you like this content, if you like the show, make sure you hit that like button. It's all I require. It's all I ask for as your only price of admission on the show. Hit that like button, people. There's a growing number of us, about 115 and growing across the various platforms. Hit that like button. I'm going to keep emphasizing it throughout the night as we enter this 1 hour long special and debate. And of course, if you want to support the show, lastly, all of that information is in the descriptor of this video. You can do as little as $50 a month as a commitment to this show to allow us to broadcast. And boy, oh boy, is there some exciting stuff coming in the next couple of weeks or so. With that being said, exciting stuff. Let me bring on my rather exciting panel of guests. First up in the ring is a chap who, it's his first time on the show, but I suppose to a large extent he's kicked this particular hornet's nest with a piece he wrote for the Daily Friend. That's www.dailyfriend.co.za, titled "Vaccine Passports, Please." I'm talking, of course, about Jonathon Katzenellenbogen. There he is on screen. Jonathon, good evening and welcome to the BDL Show.
Thanks.
Sorry, Jonathon, you were muted there for the first 3 seconds. Just maybe let the audience know.
Okay, here I am. Thanks so much for having me, Sihle.
Excellent. Jonathon, just for the audience who are maybe not initiated, who are you and what do you do?
I'm Jonathon Katzenellenbogen. I've been a journalist for a long time. I write about economics mainly for the Daily Friend, but politics sometimes as well. And I've been in the job for about 2 years now. I'm their columnist, weekly columnist, appearing on Wednesday mornings. Thank you.
Excellento. That's Jonathon Katzenellenbogen, or Jonathon K, as I'll say, because that surname, getting my tongue around it timelessly will be a bit difficult. Oops, did I make the same gaffe that a one Cape Town politician made? I must be racist. Oh my goodness. Sorry, Jonathon, I'm sure you're wondering what I'm talking about.
Don't worry about it.
Let me move right along to another fella who will be supporting Jonathon in this particular debate. Two fellas, of course, who are making the argument that, hey, maybe vaccine passports are not a bad idea and definitely not an infringement on liberty, given that this pandemic is very serious. But it's not for me to make that argument, just to introduce that they form one part of this team. I'm talking, of course, about Ivo Vegter. There he is. Ivo, good evening. Welcome to BDL Show.
Good evening, Sihle. Nice to be with you again.
Excellent, my brother. Good to have you on. And speaking about another brother from another mother, a chap who literally wrote the response piece to Jonathon, and a fellow who's no stranger to the BDL Show. I've had him on here on numerous occasions. The master at deciphering leftist gobbledygook and eviscerating it with liberty ideas. I'm talking, of course, about Oprah Martin van Staden from the Sakelege team and, of course, the Free Market Foundation. Martin, good evening and welcome to the BDL Show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Good to have you, man. Pardon me for all these sips of water. I took a walk this afternoon, so I'm feeling rather parched. With that being said, another guy who is like water, an oasis in the desert of leftist ideas, and that liberty oasis that is so sorely needed in this country. Oh, Chris Hattingh, also from the Free Market Foundation. Chris, good evening. Welcome to the BDL Show.
Good evening, Sihle, and to the fellow panelists. I can't beat that intro, so I'll just leave now. I mean, nothing can beat that intro, so thanks.
homie, good to have you on the show, fellas. Let's get straight into it because, I'm just looking at the comment section already, and it is a buzz by people who, obviously I did bait people a little bit in how I framed the questioning because I know that this topic is very emotive. And people have very strong opinions on it right now. But on here, we're going to have that conversation in a much more rational way, and actually have people weigh up these arguments and decide for themselves, especially because what we're going to be talking about has actual policy consequences, looming in this country, given the conversation that the politicians themselves are having. Jonathon, I must begin with you because really it was your piece that kicked this off. And maybe for the benefit of those who didn't read it, and I should have linked it in the descriptor, I'll do that after the show. Jonathon, what was your main argument here? You're obviously saying, hey, let's actually have these vaccine passports. Why?
vaccination rates mean we might be back to a new normal soon. But vaccine hesitancy by sizable portions of the population could curb or delay us reaching herd immunity. And that will force us for a long time into tightened lockdowns with every new wave. Now, so my argument is essentially that vaccine passports, that is requiring people to show evidence of inoculation, is a path to liberty. And you can't really argue against this. Without these documents, our emergence into the new normal will be slow and hobbled, and governments will maintain their regulations. Making vaccines mandatory, on the other hand, I'm not in favor of that. But I do believe that making vaccine passports or showing evidence of double jabs is a path to liberty, and you can nudge people into having vaccines through this. The vaccination process needs to speed up for herd immunity to be achieved soon. And this is a public good. You can't doubt this. The efficacy of vaccines has been proven. It's a cost-effective approach to the pandemic. Rather than having many people take up ICU places, you can instead reduce the demand for this through vaccines. That's proven over and over. Vaccine passports are on the way, whether their opponents like it or not. This week, I received an invitation to a year-end function, and guess what? One has to email proof of having a vaccine. Perfectly reasonable for me. I want protection. They want protection. The vaccinated spread of the disease. The vaccinated spread the disease less than the vaccinated. That's proven. As a private organization, this company which invited me are perfectly entitled to insist on what effectively are covered passports. Perfectly reasonable to me. And I don't think the libertarians can raise a hue and cry over this because it's a private organization. Since the introduction of vaccine passports in France in early August, people are now required to show these documents to get on a plane or train or enter a restaurant or bar. The day after the policy was announced, guess what? 1 million people signed up for vaccines, and higher vaccine rates helped lower the number of COVID cases and people in hospital. This is proof of a public good and greater liberty and reduced harm to society that comes from vaccine passports. And in Italy, I read this week, civil servants must be double jabbed. And guess what? The vaccination centers were overrun after they introduced the new regulation. Vaccinations lower the risk of infection spreading the disease and crowding up hospitals and intensive care units. Jabs mean far fewer hospital admissions and therefore a vast saving of public resources. The idea of vaccine passports horrifies many libertarians who see government overstepping the mark and threatening civil liberties. And the idea that vaccine passports are a nudge to have the jab is viewed by some as tantamount to a government forcibly injecting its citizens. To compare vaccine passports to apartheid-era passbooks is ludicrous. As vaccinations are free and easily available, there's no problem maintaining access to vaccines. Hence, the claim of exclusion on unfair grounds, discrimination, is not valid. Moreover, places to which the public are admitted have a right to refuse entry to individuals. Why is there not a sound protest to those vaccination certificates, which one must show at least a yellow fever jab to gain entry into most countries? And that has been the case for decades. The reason is that these are now accepted, and it's not controversial, and people realize the public good. You want a source of authority on this. The ultimate source of authority on questions such as these is the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill. There is a strong argument that Mill would have favored these vaccines based on the harm principle. On liberty, Mill wrote, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Not having a vaccine causes potential harm to others, as people are then at higher risk of infection with COVID, spreading the disease and pushing up use of scarce medical resources. Therefore, having to present vaccine certificates to gain entry to crowded places is a public good and perfectly acceptable and reduces harm. Allowing the unvaccinated to entry to public gatherings would therefore pose a risk of harm to society. Some libertarians argue that vaccine passports are the start of a slippery slope to draconian intrusions in our daily lives. Well, are vaccination certificates that you must show at borders an intrusion? I argue that these vaccination passports will lead to the opening up of society. Pressure will be needed, but it will happen. The government's response to the pandemic has greatly threatened liberty, with its curfews and restrictions on movements and activities, not all of which have been key to social distancing. One way of preventing governments from going down the slippery slope of infringing liberties would be through the introduction of vaccine passports. Vaccination passports are the way for these regulations to be dropped. The US is opening up to travel. Guess why? Guess why? The reason is vaccine passports. Vaccine passports are a path to liberty rather than a curb, and the libertarians should stand up and admit this. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Again, thank you very much, Jonathan. And again, I do understand the argument you're setting out. Maybe just I forgot to mention, just for the benefit of the viewers, I'm going to give each speaker, around 5 to 6 minutes or so, just for them to open up, as I did with Jonathon, who really set it off quite literally, as we say in rap battles. And to respond to that, again, also giving him 5 to 6 minutes, will be Martin from Staden, because he wrote a response piece on this. Again, all these pieces you can find on the Daily Friend. I cannot stress enough. Let the Daily Friend news paper, be your go-to for all news, analysis, and opinion. www.dailyfriend.co.za. And hey, hit that like button, whether you agree with the speakers or not. You're doing it for me, your favorite fat boy, Sihle Ngobese, Big Daddy Liberty. Welcome to it. We're getting this conversation going. And indeed, to do exactly that, Martin, I'm going to give you your 6 minutes, homie. Why is this position a problem? There's 3 or 4 key areas in which Jonathon sort of raises here. The one being, of course, a rejection of the mandates, as he says. So as I described at the beginning, not so much the stick, but definitely the carrot, he argues, of a vaccine passport. And again, let's set out a quick definition here. A vaccine passport, as is defined and as we're seeing currently as it's been rolled out in certain places, effectively is a piece of document of sorts that, you show once you've been double-dosed vaccinated, and it allows you entry into common spaces that used to be open to everybody, but now would require, demonstrating that you are vaccinated, against COVID-19. So Jonathon put it quite ably and said, look, it's not an attack on our liberties. In fact, it's a public good.
Yeah, thanks, Sihle. Thanks, Jonathon, as well, for that concise summary of your position. So my response to that in the article and here basically goes as follows. Let me qualify firstly that I'm only going to talk about government mandates and government passports. There's a discussion to be had about vaccine passports being asked for by private entities, but that's a big discussion that I don't think we have time for here, so I'll leave that aside. But on that point, in my view, a vaccine mandate, literally holding a citizen down and injecting them with the vaccine, and the vaccine passport, if done by government, are exactly the same thing, just through a different method. If you enact law or regulation that says a South African or whoever cannot leave their homes unless they take the vaccine, then you are effectively mandating it. I mean, if you arrive at a private store that's willing to let you in, but the law says you cannot without showing this vaccine passport, then it's really the same as mandating it. No one will really have a choice but to have something injected into them that they don't want. And let me qualify: I'm very pro-vaccine. I think the efficacy has been shown, so I'm not worried personally. But I know there are people who object, and as a good liberal, I must respect their right to make that decision for themselves. Now, I think our constitution does provide some clear guidelines here. I'm not arguing from the constitution. I think as a liberal principle, your self-ownership over your own body is literally where your liberty begins. We can get into private property rights and EWC and all these things, but you can't even get there without starting at the human body. So that's where it starts. And Section 12.2b, I believe, says that everyone in South Africa has the right to bodily and psychological integrity, including the right to have control over their own bodies. So I think our positive law, our highest law, sets that beyond question, really. There is the limitations clause, the weasel clause, but that is a pretty high standard to meet. You need to prove that there aren't any less restrictive means, which there are. Certainly, given that most South Africans, quite by far, are quite okay with being vaccinated. They're keen to get vaccinated. People in the riskiest categories seem to be very keen to get vaccinated, above 40 thereabouts. So there we don't need to worry. There are less restrictive means. So I'm not sure the Section 36 weasel test will be passed. And then, of course, just to close off my little introduction, is the point of the slippery slope. Now, I'm going to stand by that. It's certainly a slippery slope. Using the argument about the yellow fever jabs, I think maybe we should have objected to that. I wasn't around when that was introduced. I certainly would have objected to that if I was around, especially because it's a government mandated thing that you need to inject into your body. Now, I've had the injection. I didn't think too much about it because there was the process wasn't as politicized quite as much as this is. So there's a lot more coverage to spread a liberal message here. So certainly, let's not say that because we accepted a bad principle in the past, we should continue to accept it. Let's rather work that back and reestablish bodily integrity as an important principle of public policy. And then just the last thing is this idea that because lockdowns have been so bad, we need to get out of it. I agree completely, but let's ask government to impose another authoritarian measure to do that. Now, when you use government's own prior authoritarian illiberal policies to justify more government illiberal policies, you are setting that slippery slope, and you are telling the government, hey, you can just engage in this type of trickery. You can impose something bad on us and then propose something that seems lesser to get us out of your initial own bad policy decision. And that is a freeway to tyranny. And that does lead to self-ownership being, as a core liberal principle, really falling away. Maybe not now, maybe in 200 years when we've gone through several stages of this, whereby at that point we will say, but look, we accepted this principle for COVID, we accepted it for X, Y, and Z. What are the libertarians going on about? We're free as we sit here in our handcuffs. Why are we worrying? So we need to look at the history of government and how it's grown, how it's infringed more and more into our affairs, and we need to be very careful. And we need to be guided by our very first liberal principles that you can trace back to John Locke, to Frederick Bastiat. Mill is somewhere over there, I guess. But look at Locke, look at Bastiat. These guys really put it very succinctly that you start with the body, you start there, you build out the private property. And sure, if you want to keep people who aren't vaccinated off your private property, by all means, but leave the government out of it. The government isn't there to impose your preferences, your safety concerns on other people. Liberty is risky. Society is risky. That's just one of those things we need to accept if we want freedom. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that really does cover a lot of the initial points that Jonathon makes. but there's always room here to push back. And now, bear in mind, full disclosure, I have a position here, but I'm not going to share it because I do want to fairly moderate this. So I'm going to play devil's advocate to both sides in this discussion, and I'll be vicious in doing so. So prepare yourselves, gentlemen. But you know, Martin, someone might listen to your rebuttal and go, yeah, it's a good point made there, but it's COVID-19, damn it. This is a very serious virus. There are people right now, as we're talking, who are literally on their last breath. I don't mean that as, you know, to be poetic in my language, but I literally mean this. And another common rebuttal I often hear, Martin, but I'll let Ivor ride on it and just pushing back to you, and then I'll let you all respond after this, is, well, you know, we've lost people already to this virus. So what's a few measures, temporary, if you want to argue, that they're anti-liberty, right? They're temporary in this sense, just to get this damn thing under control, because I really mean it when I say this. COVID is a massive problem. Take it from me, the obese, pre-diabetic, hypertensive dude who's had it, yes, but even I recognize that there are people who have the same metrics of me who weren't as lucky or who didn't make it out as I have. And Ivor, this is, I think, the part that sometimes people do miss, that people are dying to this virus. Yes, there's viruses and diseases all over that kill us, but this thing is flooding our hospitals and it's creating a bit of a mess.
Yeah, no, it is, and you know, it's always difficult to take something like this back to first principles, but I'm going to try and do that. You know, if you look at the ideal small government of classical liberals, or the small government wing of libertarianism, you know, if you ignore the anarchists, this small government has as its primary purpose to protect the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens. All right. Now, this primarily means that it ought to protect lives, liberty, and property from encroachment from others. Right. So we have laws against theft, fraud, assault, and murder. You know, Martin says, you know, if you don't want unvaccinated people on your property, then, well, you are entitled to not let them onto your property. But what if they do? What if they do trespass and they ignore you? How are you protected then? This is why we have laws against trespass and theft and assault and murder, and the government steps in. We call the police, and we have this person removed. So saying that the government isn't involved or shouldn't be involved, that's a bit of a facile argument to my mind. These laws are inherently coercive, right? And they follow the harm principle that was so eloquently expressed by Jonathon earlier, John Stuart Mill's harm principle. It is legitimate to coerce people in order to prevent harm to others. With vaccinations, the case is a little bit more grey. Right? Let's first stipulate that, yes, the disease is serious. Yes, the vaccines work. You know, we've all seen the charts of how many vaccinated and unvaccinated people end up in ICU in hospitals or end up dying. Let's also stipulate that they significantly reduce both the infection rate and the transmission rate of the virus that causes COVID-19. Now, I have seen a few sort of outliers that were probably cherry-picked that suggest this might not be so, but there are piles of studies that I've seen that show that they certainly do protect not only the vaccinee, but also other people. And this is, I think, is particularly important, especially in the case of frail people, cancer patients, people who otherwise suffer from a compromised immune system that cannot be vaccinated. Right? How do you protect them? You can say, well, you know, other people get vaccinated, so they are protected by the vaccine. But what about the people that can't be vaccinated? How are they protected from those who refuse to vaccinate and are more likely to be carriers of the disease? Now, in this case, the harm to others of the unvaccinated is indirect, right? But that is also true for drunk driving. Now, it's fun to make a libertarian argument that says people should be free to drive drunk as much as they please and only be held responsible if they actually do cause harm to others. Right? You can make similar arguments about crossing red lights. You know, let them. You know, it's fine if they don't actually kill anyone. Then what harm was done? But we don't operate like that. Right? We stop people, we fine people for crossing red lights because they might cause harm to others. Right? And the same with drunk driving. We prohibit drunk driving, and we consider it a justifiable infringement on one's liberty in order to reduce a significant threat of harm to others. So I'm not convinced that mandating vaccines necessarily violates liberal principles. In fact, I think the government is, in a way, the only entity that can attempt to protect citizens against infectious disease. What is the alternative? That we just let disease spread uncontrolled, limiting ourselves to giving advice, and then just tolerating those who willfully ignore that advice and thereby put not only themselves but other people at risk? I haven't heard any good libertarian arguments for how a free market would cope with infectious disease outbreaks, right, other than letting them rip through our populations at will. In fact, I think controlling infectious diseases is the only legitimate purpose of the World Health Organization, and it falls squarely within the small government mandate of protecting lives, liberty, and property. Look, there are disadvantages to making vaccines compulsory, not least that this will appear to confirm the worst fears of the conspiracy theorists about their effectiveness, or the tyrannical intent behind them, and not least that the government, certainly the South African government, is probably not capable of enforcing a universal vaccine mandate. So because of those disadvantages, I don't actually advocate mandatory vaccines. But then I'm also not going to be moved to strongly oppose them if the government does decide to require them. I don't think they violate liberal principles. So, you can consider me sort of agnostic on mandatory vaccines as a matter of policy. It's a moot point because I don't think government will require vaccination, and they probably couldn't enforce it if they wanted to, which then brings us to the vaccine passport issue. Government is proposing to issue vaccine passports. Now, private entities in foreign countries are entitled to attach conditions to who they deal with, right? And not posing a reasonably avoidable risk to others is among them. Now, for that purpose, I think a formal and fairly secure vaccine passport based on records in the electronic vaccine data system will be rather more reliable than those little hand-scribbled little cards that everyone got. I would, based on the evidence I've seen to date, support the idea of also issuing immunity passports to people who've recovered from COVID. Or perhaps saying, well, a recovery from COVID counts for one shot, and you only need one additional shot in order to be considered fully immune. That we can discuss about the details. But in general, I think a vaccine passport, I agree with Jonathon, it would go a long way towards encouraging vaccination, which I think is a public good. Shortening the path to herd immunity, getting our moribund tourism and hospitality industries back on their feet, and reintegrating South Africa into the global economy, getting off the UK's red list, for example.
Okay, lots of pushback already in the comments section to this. And just a reminder, please. Y'all are vicious. Just a reminder, please. I will be playing devil's advocate, and I'll be vicious to both sides of this debate. And guys, let's not be childish, please, in the comments. Oh, I don't like what's being said here, I'm going to leave. Guys, it's a debate, a discussion. Hear the sides, hear the arguments. Pose your questions, please. Let me put them up on screen. And as I said, we're looking at about an hour discussion, but we're running a little bit behind, and I haven't gotten to Chris yet. So if we can't cram it into the hour, I'll ask the guests to indulge me just by another 20 minutes or so, just to allow everybody to wrap up properly. And with that being said, let me go into that devil's advocate position and say, well, I hear your arguments, but it doesn't reconcile, and the question you pose is a good one, insofar as how would the free market deal with the outbreak of an infectious disease? But there's two parts to this question. How would individuals respond when given the information on how a said disease spreads and what measures to take to protect yourself? How would an individual who runs a private entity, whether it's the home or a business, respond to this? And is there therefore a requirement for the state to mandate those millions of people, those hundreds of thousands of businesses, mandate something as a one-size-fits-all, where they're using the stick of a vaccine passport, the stick of a vaccine mandate and lockdown, or the carrot, which still requires state force, by way of a vaccine passport. Maybe let me pose the question to Chris as he rebuts perhaps some of the points you were making, because I do think you left out space there around how the individual should be given the freedom to respond once informed with information, and obviously those individuals who run businesses, how they too would respond to either help fight the infectious outbreak of a disease, COVID or not, versus just to fight an infectious disease. Sorry, there's no versus anything. Chris, I don't know what your take is, but just wrap it up for us, please, insofar as your guys' position, and then I'm going to open it up to conversation and, of course, questions from the audience.
Thank you, Sihle, for allowing me to go last after such well-esteemed and reasoned arguments. I really appreciate being put in this position. So, I mean, my opposition to vaccine passports and mandates broadly has an ideological and moral bent, and then a practical bent. So ideologically and morally, I think the individual's liberty is the standard and not the undefined common good. I don't find utilitarianism to be an adequate enough method for defending individual liberty. Some people would consider pornography or smoking marijuana to go against their version of the quote-unquote public good, and it would be a fundamentally illiberal position to accept that. The burden of proof rests on those who seek further infractions of liberty, and given what has happened over the last year and a half, that bar is incredibly high. Throughout history, states have accrued more power, and they usually never let it go. When we talk about the society and the public good, I don't think there are collective rights, sort of morally, conceptually. There are individual rights. It should not be the purview of Cabinet or the National Coronavirus Command Council or the Minister of Health to determine what the public good is or public health, and to then have the power to somehow attain that good, or indeed an average level of public health. In terms of individual rights being conditional, this is often an argument against sort of libertarians, objectivists, talking the straw man of objectivists and libertarians seeing man as an island. Your rights are conditional in the context of society. The only context in which they are conditional is because you don't need or really have to think about your rights if you are alone on an island, but within the context of society. The only time when your rights are conditional is when you violate another person's rights through force or fraud. We can think of it this way: your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. When someone has been shown to be carrying COVID-19 and they've deliberately infected someone else, I think there's a case to be made for the state to step in there. While there's a chance that a person might be infected with COVID, should everyone be preemptively treated in this way and denied access to certain spaces, public spaces, as though they are carrying COVID? I would argue this opens the door for massive state abuse. A lot of human behavior could carry the potential to negatively harm others. Where is the line to be drawn as to how all manner of behavior should be preemptively controlled? And do we really want to grant the state that kind of power? There is a fundamental moral difference between the imposition of statewide mandates versus voluntary uptake by citizens and businesses. And then just on the practical side, and my concerns around mandates and what effects they might have, and I'll be quick to wrap up. So I agree government has a role to protect people's liberty, but we need to define very clearly what actions the government will take, and these need to be objective and transparently communicated. Will vaccine mandates create a new industry for illicit or bribed versions of vaccine passports? Many South Africans are not that tech savvy, despite the best plans and speeches by our esteemed President Ramaphosa. We do not yet have the fourth industrial revolution. Will vaccine passports be on smartphones only? How will South Africans who don't have smartphones have access to them and use them to move around when they're already desperate to find work and to move around the country? There's the potential that this will create an in-group versus an out-group and create more tension in society. There's a possibility that this sort of policy plan will increase vaccine hesitancy, which we don't want. Governments have, over the last 2 years, continually shifted the goalposts. Just this week, the UK announced that fully vaccinated people from some countries, including South Africa, won't be allowed to travel there. Ivo can correct me if I'm wrong here, if they've defined by what sort of measure, but I haven't seen that as yet. Thus, my question is, will vaccine passports be objectively implemented, or will they simply be used for politicking between countries? And then again, the most negative effects will be felt by citizens of countries. South Africa needs other much more serious and radical reforms to get actual economic growth going. I don't think vaccine mandates and passports are necessarily the best way to get there. We need to abandon things like expropriation without compensation to get actual economic growth going. And given how destructively governments have acted, I don't know that we should expect them to surrender the quote-unquote emergency powers that they have accrued over the last 2 years. The standard, the sort of expectation is way too low, especially in countries like South Africa, where our president doesn't even take questions after his family meetings, quote unquote. And then Sihle, just on your last point about individual action and individuals sort of using information and acting on their own, I'm busy reading a book by Ryan Bourne. The title is Economics in One Virus, and that title is a play on a book by Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson. And Ryan, I'm about halfway through, and the author points out how in the States, his book is state-centric, US, America-centric, but he talks about how private citizens and businesses changed their behavior and adapted to the threat of COVID-19 well before states started imposing curfews and other restrictions and lockdowns. So it wasn't, nothing was ever perfect. And I'm not saying that will result in the quote unquote least amount of harm or deaths, but people in some states chose to act in a responsible way, even before their governors and the federal government decided to tell them that they need to go into lockdown.
Thanks, Chris. And again, key points that you raised there. And in fact, there's something I actually also wanted to quickly raise. Oh dear, my battery's about to die. Can you guys just give me 2 seconds, please? Let's quickly do this. Thankfully, we are prepared. Excellent. There we go. Fellas, let me push back a little bit. I'm going to push back to Jonathon and Ivor, because there's a lot of comments here that have come up here, aside from the usual that I get of, the two of you are either indoctrinated or you're working for Big Pharma. I'm going to leave this aside because I know the both of you, or at least I know Ivor well. Jonathon, I don't know. Maybe you are working for Big Pharma. Dun, dun, dun.
No, they've never offered me a job. And I've never applied for one.
They need to cut you that check, homie, because it definitely is the COVID grift in their part of the world. But look, guys, for a moment, let me be serious. I think there is a concern, fellas, that either the vaccine mandate or the vaccine passport simply does not pass the rationality test insofar as what it is telling us it is meant to achieve versus what the data already tells us is a kind of a world that it is with COVID-19. Let me be precise and specific. If we're telling people, remember I argued that the libertarian position perhaps should posit that it should be the individual families and really those who are in that society who should make decisions around whether they take it or not take it based on being given sound information, sound advice. If that is the assumption that someone is working off from a libertarian perspective, it would stand to reason then that there's absolutely no reason for the state to get involved by way of either a mandate or a passport, because you've got to factor in other things such as natural immunity, for example. The recent study or estimate done by Discovery posited that, look, as things stand, they're estimating that as much as 80% of South African society has already gone through the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And of course, as we now know, the Panda Group, for example, have been instrumental in pointing this out, that once you've had this particular virus, it accrues onto you a naturally acquired immunity, which is akin, if not better, actually, than the vaccine itself. So that the vaccine definitely has a place to play, a role to play. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. Of course, there's a place to, a role, pardon me, for the vaccine. But the vast majority of us have had this virus, have the immunity. So why should we then see the state jump in with the vaccine passport? It simply doesn't make sense. Jonathon, and then Ivor.
I just want to. I can't unfortunately remember the member of the audience who asked the question, but it was, can we show an antibody test? And
Yes.
that is increasingly allowed for a vaccine passport, but I think it only lasts for 90 days. And the current medical view, I think, is that natural immunity does not last as long as that offered through vaccination. Of course, these things do change, but that is I think the current opinion. And the other view is that the more severe your COVID case, the better your immunity. So yeah, but of course, showing doing an antibody test and showing that you have gone through the disease serves the purpose. I just want to address one of the arguments that Martin van Staden made, that you can't use the threat of government infringements of liberty to then come up and say this is a way out of it. I had argued that the vaccinations are a way out of the government-imposed restrictions. Firstly, Martin, as you're well aware, that and has been stated previously, that there was a lot of voluntary action in the lockdowns, effectively, before regulations were even imposed. Worldwide, cities were locking down. So this affords an opportunity to get out of that. Then your second argument was that freedom begins with our bodies. Yes, I would agree with that in the case of the right to abortion and so forth. But this is a disease which harms. If someone has an abortion, no one else in society, I would argue, is infringed. You could argue that the right of the unborn is infringed, but I wouldn't hold to that, particularly if it's done within the required period. So I think that, to say it begins with our bodies is a invalid argument. I would say that, if your body, if you are, leprosy has been eradicated. If you are a leper, if you have TB, these are recognized highly transmissible diseases, and there is a social good from either isolation or compulsory, or I'm not going to say compulsory vaccination, because I don't believe in that, and I believe it would be counterproductive. But you must remember, above all, that many private organizations, rather than governments, are coming up with the need for vaccine passports because people want them. You could say this is mob rule, but it's people demanding them. They won't go to work if people don't show evidence of vaccination. And as for the role of the state in enforcing people to do this, I think you're not really seeing the right picture. I think the state has a right to be involved in public health of this sort. I mean, you could have vaccination programs done by the private sector, but in its regulation and creating the rules. So I just don't see where I think many of the arguments that the libertarians are using have fall away. I think libertarian thoughts are very good to do with wider economic activity, pricing, and lack of government intervention. But when it comes to these issues, I think there's a public good in government intervening. Thank you very much.
Sure. And again, I have a few issues with that, but I want to pose them to Ivo with an additional question, because Ivo, I can tell you now, as someone who's once again a resident of Umlazi here in Durban, just outside the township, just outside of Durban. Sorry, I can tell you now, any talk or any suggestion that there should be an imposition of a vaccine passport, i.e., telling the vast majority of Black South Africans who live here that once again you will have to show paperwork, in order to enter certain facilities, even if you argue it's in the interest of public good, that is public health and the like, would be met with a visceral anger that would dwarf what we saw as those riots of a few months ago. Because I think the memory of a authority telling you where you can and cannot be by way of paperwork that must be on you at all times is deeply troubling for a lot of people. But then you might argue, but hang on, we have that same scenario when, trying to take our kids to school, for example, because, those need inoculation. But they'll argue that is a function that still leaves me with choice insofar as I can homeschool or take my kids to a private school that would not require this. Thus, the notion, what it whittles down to is the freedom to choose. Are you looking to take away that freedom to choose by way of this vaccine passport? Is it flowery language to basically make this palatable?
Oh, look, the vaccine passport in principle doesn't take away your right to choose. It just says that, if people want to ask you about your vaccine status, then you now have a secure and reliable, trusted means of demonstrating your vaccine status to them. Nobody forces anyone to use the vaccine passports, to require the vaccine passports. So you're very likely to be able to be allowed into your average pub without showing a vaccine passport. You're not likely to be allowed onto an aircraft, though. Right? And I think one of the issues with the UK, for example, why we are still on the red list, even for double vaccinated, fully vaccinated people, is because they don't trust those little handwritten, scribbled cards that we got. They don't trust that we can prove that we've been vaccinated. Right? All I can show them is that handwritten card. I know that some of those cards have been stolen from vaccine points. I know that they are easily printable on a laser printer. I can make these things hand over fist. Maybe I should. It's a business opportunity there. But the thing is, the UK knows this, and the UK knows that they don't trust our proof of vaccination. So therefore, they're going to keep us on the red list until we actually do have a reliable vaccine passport that can be verified against the government's database of who has and hasn't been vaccinated. The point, you make a very good point about whether people will accept it. And, I think maybe they won't. Maybe there will be a rebellion against this. And I think more's the pity, because that will probably mean that, a whole lot of things that might have opened up, businesses that might have restarted, tourism that might have restarted, then won't restart. Right? There'll be consequences to refusing these vaccine passports. The idea that we have a problem with showing papers, well, yeah, in principle we do, but in practice, right, anytime I enter into any sort of credit agreement, I show my ID document. Right? And there's a whole bunch of other reasons why I show my ID document too. There's housing estates that require me to show an ID document, in order to be let in. And these are private restrictions. We all carry our driver's licenses, and we don't have a problem with cops stopping us randomly and saying, "Where's your driver's license? Show us this document that tells me that you are entitled to be where you are right now and doing what you're doing right now." So I'm not sure that really follows necessarily. The problem with the past laws was that they were discriminatory, that they generally violated people's freedom of movement based on who they were, right? And for no very good reason. There was no good reason to restrict their movement. So I don't think that there's a valid comparison to be made. In fact, I think it trivializes the evils of apartheid to suggest that a vaccine passport would be equivalent to the Dom Pass, or any other sort of really excessive sort of tyrannical restriction on freedom of movement. And then I just want to address the 80% natural immunity issue. I'm not sure on what discovery basis they claim that 80% of us might have been exposed to the virus already. If it is true, and if the claims of people like Panda that natural immunity is equivalent to a vaccine or superior to a vaccine in terms of immunity, then we will soon know. because there will not be a fourth wave. Right. Shabi Mahdi says that with the transmissibility of the Delta variant, which is higher than the original variant, herd immunity should be reached around about 84%. I've done a similar calculation based on how fast the Delta variant does reproduce, and it's somewhere between 80 and 90% where we reach herd immunity. So 84% seems perfectly reasonable. If we're already at 80%, then we'll be at 84% in no time, and then we'll have reached herd immunity, which means we will not see further transmission of the virus. Right? If we do see further transmission of the virus in the next few months, right, then the entire claim that either we've reached 80% natural immunity or that natural immunity is equivalent to vaccine immunity falls apart. So I think we'll know soon enough whether or not that's true. If events overtake the need for a vaccine passport, or overtakes the need for vaccination altogether, nobody would be happier than me. And I think ultimately events will overtake it. Yeah, I think a few years from now we'll probably end up with a variant of the virus that is not particularly deadly, that is not particularly dangerous, that is highly contagious and spreads easily, but that we can treat like we treat the flu or the common cold today. So ultimately, I think events will overtake the whole debate. Until then, however, I think vaccinations are necessary, and I think vaccine passports are justified.
But hang on, Ivo, I'm going to push back here because I think you're sort of skirting the degrees to which where the line can be drawn versus those who hold the freedom argument and say actually the power to draw that line should not rest with the state at all. And I'll come to Chris after this because I know he has a question to ask. And let me pose it to you this way. Tuberculosis is, and I nearly used the was, it still is a massive problem in specifically your Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and KZN in particular, to the extent where, in addition to what its transmissibility, which is also just as easy, by the way, in addition to its transmissibility, compound it to those who actually have HIV/AIDS, and it literally was the death sentence that COVID is often argued is. But TB actually was. I'll take it one step further. There's even now variants of TB which are even a bit more difficult to extremely difficult because they're resistant to drugs. Where am I going with this? At no point at the zenith, perhaps, of ETB here in KZN did we ever see even the suggestion that the state should have the power. Even if they localized it, for example, because of where, at no state did we have the suggestion, maybe a vaccine passport is important, especially because TB, much like COVID, if you're in a crowded taxi, someone coughs, massive problem. If you're in a bus in winter where no one wants to really open the windows, trust me, I know, it's a massive problem. And I can go down the line. And we saw deaths there, Ivo. So in reality, why is it good for the gander and not good for the goose? Insofar as if we allow COVID, what's to stop them from saying, well, it worked for COVID, let's move to TB and let's move to something else. Or even flu, by the way.
Well, look, the very first vaccine that is given in South Africa to a newborn baby is the TB vaccine. Right. And I think there's a second one. I'm not sure exactly what the vaccine schedule looks like, but the vaccine is routinely given to newborns, and they do take TB seriously in this country. In fact, there's a lot of work going on against dealing with TB and HIV while they are dealing with COVID right now. So people come in, they get triaged, and they do treat people for TB and HIV and other conditions as well. I'm not an expert on TB, so I don't know what the transmissibility is. I don't know if you have had the vaccine as a baby. I'm not sure to what extent you are still vulnerable as an adult. I would imagine not very. So the people who are vulnerable to it are people that weren't vaccinated as babies. I'm not sure. So I'm not sure it is a comparable case.
Sure, but let me move leaving aside comparability, the point I was trying to drive at, though, is the number of cases and the number of deaths are extremely high. And factor in, for example, the point you're making, that this is post, of course, nearly everybody being vaccinated at birth, pardon me, I'm right, vaccinated at birth for TB, but at no point, even with those high numbers, at no point, even at the point where TB was generally one of the leading killers at one point in our hospitals, was there ever a suggestion that a vaccine passport should be a means of controlling this, spread? And by the way, it really was a bad spread. I mean, there were cases where, if anything, I want to go back to where I began my conversation. It was the information, tiniest information given to the public that actually saw us shift behavior into people being able to manage their own risk. So if it was good for that, why are we not able to do the same thing for COVID? Why must COVID have a vaccine? Sorry, I must press you on that one.
Oh. Well, then where do you draw the line, right? If you then say, well, okay, COVID is actually worse than TB in terms of the number of people it kills, but where do you draw the line then? Would you then accept vaccine passports for a virus that is maybe 5 or 10 times as deadly as COVID is? If COVID was as severe, as virulent as the original SARS was, for example, would you then accept vaccine passports? Assuming that the virus didn't sort of burn itself out early on, which is what happened with the original SARS. It's. I don't think that it's easy to make to really draw a line there. I'm not sure that I could argue strongly against a TB vaccine passport, or at least some sort of system whereby the government tracks who has and hasn't been vaccinated for TB. I think that might be a useful public health intervention. Especially because it is highly transmissible. You're right. Unlike with HIV, for example, which is there's a lot you can do to protect yourself against HIV. That's not necessarily true with TB, especially not in crowded and fairly unsanitary living conditions.
Well, let me disagree, because I mean, as of 2018, the TB topped the list of the leading causes of death in South Africa. Tuberculosis. Yeah, that's. Which, by the way, I must just quickly include, influenza and pneumonia in particular were in the top 6, top 5. No,
but this year, top 10. This year it's COVID. This year it's COVID.
I don't know the COVID is out yet, because even Staden say. Sorry, yeah.
I actually saw an article just the other day that showed that COVID is now a bigger killer than TB and HIV combined.
Okay, I'm going to take that with a pinch of salt, because I haven't seen that data from Staden. I'm getting my data from there. But okay, for a moment, I'll accept that may be the case. But the principle still remains. If you are able to tackle TB without having to resort to vaccine passports, why does COVID-19 suddenly get its own special category? But let me not get bogged down there.
May I just come in there? The reason is because you don't want ICUs filling up, and that is the problem. We've had, as one of our a member of the audience pointed out, he says that during the third wave, ICUs have been full, and it's a tremendous problem. TB doesn't do that.
Sure.
They're in sanatoriums. Influenza has the potential to do that. But for disease, for a disease that gives you a quick end, COVID does. You might not need these sorts of measures, but COVID doesn't. You can partially.
But Jonathan, I don't want to take the space for my two opposing viewpoints here. Chris, I'm going to come to you now. But on this issue of flooding ICUs, immediately, and I'm seeing some of the comments. In the comment section is, but hang on, the purpose of the lockdown was to augment capacity. So you can't use this argument. It's almost, you can't have the state have its cake and eat it too. On the one hand, it argues a lockdown was there to augment these very services so that we don't have these issues. We can accommodate the increased influx of COVID cases at an ICU level. But at the same time, argue, but hang on, we do need the COVID vaccine because we're still being swamped by this. Again, I accept that there's a lot of incompetence by the state insofar as prepping hospitals and the like, but I'm sorry, I must come to Chris, and then I think it'll come to you anyway after that, because the question he had was for you. Chris?
Thanks, Sihle. I had a question for either Ivor or Jonathon, whoever wants to take it, and then a question for Martin. As a philosopher, I'll ask questions, so then I don't have to answer any difficult questions. I'll put that to my fellow panelists. But to either Jonathon or Ivor, Bastiat, we've referenced Mill, for example. So Bastiat often talked about unforeseen consequences. So just what are the worst unforeseen consequences that you can see of a possible vaccine passport? Is it as simple as maybe vaccine hesitancy or the other stuff that we haven't considered yet? And then to Martin, I just want to ask, how would a free market deal with this kind of thing? I mean, I don't think either of us, I'm speaking on your behalf here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but neither of us are anarchists. So we sort of see a night watchman state, as it were, maybe in the Nozick model. So how do you think in that sort of scenario one would deal with a pandemic like COVID? Thanks.
I think the first the question you asked, Chris, unforeseen consequences of passports. I don't think that there are severe unforeseen consequences. Vaccine hesitancy is one. Which is why, that this is something that needs to be addressed, I think. But it would be much worse with the vaccine mandate in terms of vaccine hesitancy. I'm just not entirely sure that vaccine hesitancy, which is largely based on misinformation, is really a valid objection to something like a vaccine passport, because there are significant benefits to vaccine passports in terms of actually freeing up society, opening up society, allowing people to do business again, allowing people to travel again, allowing people to, allowing tourism to open up again, and international business to open up again, etc. I even saw there was I can't remember which company it was now that had an acquisition agreement that was on ice because of COVID, and is basically waiting for enough people to be vaccinated to go ahead. So, if business M&A activity isn't even going ahead because of COVID, and that would be eased by vaccine passports. So I'm not sure that there are grave unforeseen consequences of passports. In terms of ICU capacity, yes, the government was intending to increase healthcare capacity, and the idea was, slow down the spread, flatten the curve, so that, as I said, to increase capacity. The problem is that it's fairly easy to put extra beds down in a conference center somewhere. Right? It's not easy to staff those. Right? You need for every 10 or 15 beds or whatever the ratio is, right? You need a doctor, you need a nurse. Finding those people is difficult. You can't just train them up. Doctors take 10 years to train. Nurses take many years to train. So finding the staff for them is the big problem. That is your real shortage. It's not oxygen, it's not equipment, it's not ventilators, it's not beds or bed capacity. Your problem is staff, and they did what they could. They called in all sorts of contract nurses and retired doctors and so on. They pulled in what they could in terms of human resources, but there's very much a limit to what they can do. And we've seen with each wave that hospital capacity was actually more and more under pressure. The first wave ended up being fairly small compared to the second wave, and the third wave wasn't that bad, but it was longer than the second wave, right? Which is an issue. So we still need to be careful about overwhelming our healthcare systems. There are issues with people having a heart attack and there not being ICU beds available, because COVID patients are taking up all the ICU space. There are people that have died because of that. So those are real issues that we need to take into account. I think that need to be considered in planning.
Well, again, fellas, as we must sort of whittle the conversation towards wrapping up, we're in the last 15 minutes or so of our conversation. There's two things that have popped up in the comment section, which I must also bring up because they do speak to the problems around insisting on a vaccine passport when the data, especially from other countries, is pointing to it not achieving what is, I suppose, the stated goal of it. Let me be precise. There's been two occasions now I've seen people say, how does Ivor reconcile the data coming out of Israel, for example, which is a society that is overwhelmingly vaccinated, but is still seeing a sharp increase in the number of cases and even deaths. And, how would a society like that, assuming we're heading in that same direction of vaccinating the majority of people, then use a vaccine passport if you can still get the disease and you can still pass it on, and if people are still dying for it? What's the point of the vaccine passport at that point? Ivor, and then Jonathon, and then I'll come to you, Martin.
May I answer that? Because
sure.
By all means.
Thank you. The new Israeli Prime Minister addressed that in a recent article, and he said one of the problems is that the effectiveness of the vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, that is, which is used in Israel, wanes after about 5 months, and it goes down gradually. Secondly, most of the people who, many of the people who get vaccines then go out and think that they are totally immune, which is not the case. It's Pfizer puts the figure at after the second vaccine, probably about plus 95%. Okay, so it's not total. It depends on your existing immunity. So you can't just go out and joll and go to all the parties and go to the clubs, etc. It's just not possible at the moment with the vaccines. Secondly, this is the reason that Israel has embarked on its third jab, starting with the elderly, but now they're going to do it for everyone. But remember, above all, that most of the deaths are among those who do not have the vaccines. Most of the people in hospital have not had the vaccines. So Israel doesn't really does not support the case of those who are anti-vaccine or are skeptical. The vaccines are doing their job. They're not totally effective, but they're reducing the number of people in ICUs, and the number of people that go to hospitals, and the number of people that die, and that's important. Thank you.
Sure. I'm not sure that last point is 100%, but again, I'm happy to stand corrected. But let me add maybe two to this. Ivor, I want you to grapple with something, and then I'll come to you, Martin, because hey, Mermy, we haven't come to you at all for a while. There is the other argument then that says, well, hang on, the argument around the filling up of ICUs is a bit facetious because it almost pretends as if ICUs would never fill up in the past due to, for example, flu waves or flu seasons, which, as we all know, were very, very, very severe, especially when a lot of people developed pneumonia. We've suddenly forgotten that pneumonia was a very serious condition that actually saw people being hospitalized and placed on ventilators, much like we see with COVID-19. And for those of us who were relegated to the public health system know very well that a full hospital and being told there are no beds is not a new phenomena. So that's why I think for a lot of people, when they then hear this argument being used and attributed, therefore, to COVID-19, a lot of that suspicion and hesitancy that we often talk about comes from there. There's a feeling almost that people are being dribbled and distracted in order to make COVID-19 seem as if it is the reason for the wonkiness, if you will, of supply and demand. And I accept, Ivor, for example, your point that, even if you create extra capacity, it must be staffed. And which comes back to the central point, therefore, that Martin began with, of why do we even allow the state to be at the helm of decision-making around this in its broader sense, around healthcare, when currently we're in the mess that we're in because of the state's inability to be able to factor in what are the billions of transactions required in order to deal with firstly, to provide healthcare, and secondly, deal with those few cases where there's an infectious disease of sorts that needs to be dealt with. The private sector, more flexibly, will be able to respond to this. Or is he wrong in that sense, Ivo?
No, look, I mean, it is true that seasonal flus can, in some years, overwhelm ICU capacity, or certainly fill the ICUs up. And in fact, good planning suggests that ICUs should be full. If they're not full, then you've overcapitalized your hospitals, which actually, you talk about the state, and yeah, I'm not going to defend state-run healthcare, because I think state-run healthcare is terrible. But I don't think private healthcare would necessarily solve that problem, because private healthcare, private hospitals are also not going to build ICUs that could deal with the worst flu season that you can possibly imagine. They're going to build their ICUs according to sort of the median of what they expect, and they could still be overrun. There have been cases with H1. Which one was it? The swine flu.
H1N1.
H1N1. And there've been a few others where governments around the world have been in a flat spin, have been really panicked.
That's right.
I thought that this might dramatically overwhelm the healthcare system, and they were lucky, because they were fairly virulent. They were the viruses that burnt themselves out fairly quickly. So we didn't need a coordinated global response like we've seen with COVID. COVID is the first one that really broke through and basically spread around the world, and infected pretty much everyone, or at least infected every region, every country. So, and it's likely that future pandemics will do the same and will pose the same risks. So we need to figure out a way to deal with these things, and I think we can absolutely do better than we have done. But I do think that vaccines are a very important part of the response, and of trying to mitigate A, the number of deaths, and B, the ultimate damage that these pandemics can do to the economy. And make sure that they don't just hang around for years, and the economy just never gets going again. I think we need to do a lot of planning on that side. And there's a lot that governments have done wrong, but I do not think that vaccinating is one of those things.
Martin, let me bring you in, and nearly almost to the point of maybe final comments to everybody. So maybe just factor that in, Martin, in your commentary here. You've heard the arguments, you've heard the debate, the flavor of it. Your final thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So, what Ivo just said, totally correct. There are some things that government gets wrong, and sometimes it's right. For instance, supporting the vaccine, and I think we're all, to a greater and lesser extent here, pro-vax, and I'm definitely pro-vax. I support Solidarity's perspective in their report from a few weeks ago, where they said vaccines work, they're effective, they encourage all of their members to get it, but do not compel it. I know a lot of commenters are going to be like, no, but Martin, have you considered the data? No, I really haven't. I'm not a doctor. I have absolutely no idea, but it seems to be working. People who have had the vaccine seem to survive. I've had family members getting it, and they are thriving, and I have a lot of peace of mind for them now, especially that they're a bit older. I'm keen on that. But the problem is, if you put the power in the hands of government, and that is my concern here with a lot of premises that I think are just slipping in under the rug, that aren't really being interrogated here. If you accept the principle that government needs to make these decisions at the center, then you are throwing all of your eggs in one basket. Now, the beauty and the genius of the free market, and you don't even have to call it the free market, that's a very economic thing. It seems very economic. It seems very commercial and very clinical. It's not the free market. It's just voluntarism. It is freedom. It is the ability to do what you will without being violated. to put it crudely, that the beauty of that state of liberty is that innovative solutions or not, maybe people don't come up with solutions. That's the answer. Can be no. Ivo said earlier that libertarians haven't come up with an answer to how a free market would stop an infectious disease. Now, Yeah, I mean, we are the very antithesis of central planners. We do not have the answer to everything, and I think we embrace that wholesale, that we do not have the answer to everything. Thank God that we do not have the answer to everything, and that we want to tell people what the answer is. Our answer is that there needs to be freedom. People, firms, health associations, whatever you would see in a fundamentally free society, must be allowed the room to come up with solutions that do not involve imposing central views on people. Because if you have all your eggs in that basket, a mistake at the center is a mistake for everyone. But a bottom up solution that I have no doubt would come about if we had a truly free market in healthcare. A bottom up solution would filter, because we as ordinary people who aren't part of the state, we're not mindless fools. All people are fundamentally rational. We want to survive. People want to survive. They don't just want to march to death, and that is why a majority of people want to get vaccinated. Again, thank God for that. People want to survive, and we will rationally respond. And when there's no force involved, when there's access to information, the free market will provide a solution. But we can't know that in the current environment that we're in, globally, but specifically in South Africa, given the limits on new doctors imposed by government, the limits on new hospital capacity imposed by government. Internationally, we have governments exempting specific pharmaceutical companies and healthcare associations from liability. Now, when you have all these things, you beg for a lack of trust from ordinary people in something that is fundamentally safe. It shouldn't surprise us that there is now this kind of vaccine hesitancy. Now, I know a lot of people might think I'm hopelessly academic here. We're way past the point of government having become involved in healthcare. Martin, what are you talking about? That's last century story. Now, you see, I don't accept that. I see my role as I hate calling myself an intellectual, but as a libertarian thinker, someone who does these appearances, I see my role as really trying to pull us back to a more, encourage us to pull back to a more free time. And if we never experience that free time, to create that free period in our future. Even though we've accepted the principle of yellow fever in Caucasians, Ivo mentioned driver's licenses, said we don't object. I object that we have to show driver's licenses. Thank you. I don't need permission to drive a car. But of course, government can throw me in jail if I cause an accident. The point is, we shouldn't accept these premises, because what I said in my article is that liberals, to a large extent, and I think this is part of why liberalism has receded so easily now, and we're being overtaken by national conservatives, by progressives. One of the reasons is that we've adopted a kind of radical pragmatism, where we essentially allow government to set the debate for us. If government does something, we accept it and we respond to it. We are totally reactionary. We accept the premises that are laid before us. We've largely abandoned the liberal, the very classical liberal stubbornness, really, the stubborn insistence on principles, where in America they went to literal war for a very, very small tax that was being imposed on them. You don't see that from liberals anymore. We allow government to set the narrative for us, and we fall in with it. And that is where we accept yellow fever things. We say we all accept the driver's licenses, public health care. That's a problem. And that's the reason why we're in this situation, where we can't see a free market providing solutions. That's how we got here. And my view is that, no, let's reject those premises. Let's reject all of that. Let's say our freedom needs to be given back to us immediately and unconditionally, and then leave it to us to solve the problem. How dare any state official or any politician presuppose that they can force us to solve a problem? Let the people who put the government there amongst themselves come up with the solution. If we were smart enough to elect the ANC, then we're smart, and the ANC is going to be the ones to enforce this on us, then we're smart enough to solve the problem amongst ourselves as well. So simply can't trust government. That ship has sailed. Let's not give it even more power. Let's not willingly give it more power that it will probably take. So I think Jonathon is probably right. Vaccine passports are coming, and I think we should all probably be sad about that. Not just because it doesn't matter that the vaccine works, but because of the principle and the ever decreasing sphere of individual freedom. We need to be very concerned about that. And we need to rediscover really our faith and our trust in the free market, our faith and our trust in personal responsibility, and just as a final word, also accept that the answer can be no. Society can decide that we are not going to solve this problem. The tough shit rule, unfortunately, often applies, and that could be what happens in a free society. The solution may not come out of this free society, but that's fundamentally okay, because it is the people themselves, it is in freedom making that decision. I would take a risky free society any day before I take a ostensibly safe society where government has replaced our parents and reduced us all to perpetual children dependent on it for that safety. Those are my final words. Thanks for this excellent debate. I consider these two gentlemen brilliant liberals and absolutely no animosity just because of this. So great work, guys, and excellent discussion.
Absolutely. And perhaps on that note, let me come to you, Jonathon. Just your concluding remarks.
Thank you.
I must ask you to keep them short.
Thank you, Martin. Those are very good words, and I've certainly learned a lot from you about liberalism and Chris this evening, and thanks, and from Ivo. But I've been somewhat perturbed by some of the almost violent remarks that I've seen from two members of the audience that are basically threatening violence against us. And I find this totally objectionable. I don't know if they're playing around or not, but I find that quite disturbing that they can't partake and come up with good points in this debate this evening. But I'd like to thank you so much for arranging this, and I think it's really been a good debate. But I think I stand by Ivo and I disagree on whether they should be vaccines should be mandatory or not, and I think let's just leave them completely voluntary for the time being, completely voluntary. So no one's being forced into anything, but private organizations can choose what to do, and a government can choose whether it's civil, whether it should allow hospital workers who haven't vaccinated to come in or not. And I think that most of the opinion is emerging that let's get vaccinated and get on with life. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Ivo, your final word?
Button. There we go. Sheikhle, I find myself nodding along to Martin. And anyone who knows me and has followed my writing, knows that I am libertarian and I identify with a lot of what he says. And I certainly like a lot of the arguments about the driver's license. We shouldn't need one. But I cannot entirely agree. If we went along with this idea that we should just leave everything to the free will of individuals, we would still be dying of smallpox and polio and cholera and plague, right? The latter three being very rare now these days in the world, and smallpox having been eradicated completely. Now, the same arguments were raised back in the old days. In the 30s, I think I saw some cartoons against vaccination, smallpox vaccination. And yet eradicating smallpox, I think, is one of the crowning achievements of public health. Right, and certainly it's one of the crowning achievements of the WHO, and they haven't lived up to my expectations since then, but it's a feather in their cap, absolutely. There's a risk that public health can overreach, absolutely, and we need to guard against that. But I think public health in principle is a legitimate role for a classically liberal government, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ivo. Chris, Putti, final word is yours once again.
I'll be very quick. Thanks again to the fellow panelists. Thank you for everyone for spending time with us this evening, and thank you, Big Daddy, for the platform. My final word is go and read Atlas Shrugged. If we had a world of objectivists, then we would have a robust free market, and people would make, on average, rational, right, scientific-based decisions for their lives and their livelihood. So go and read Ayn Rand.
Shout out to you, homie. Thank you very much. And a big thank you to all the panelists for having this debate. Guys, the discussion is, it's a discussion. Even as I remove them from screen now, a reminder to you who's watching this, guys, we've got to have these conversations. Don't assume that everybody holds your truth, and there shouldn't be your truth. There should be that truth. And don't assume people understand things the way you understand them. You've got to talk to fellow South Africans. I actually often sometimes see there's far too much in the comment section where people get frustrated and angry simply because person X doesn't know a topic like person Y does. And we then forget that actually it's incumbent on us to have the conversation. Ideas matter. Spread those ideas via dialogue, discussion. And I'm hoping you enjoyed exactly that, right, tonight. The fact that we can debate these things. I myself decided to play, I kept myself out of it, so to speak, or I tried to at least, and play devil's advocate to both sides of the debate. And it's enough for me to say now at the end that I actually don't want to see a vaccine passport. I don't want to see a vaccine mandate. Just like I don't trust this government with the provision of electricity or water or whatever, I sure as hell don't trust them with managing this virus, which I concede and I agree is a massive problem, but it's a problem which we, the citizenry, we, the faith flag family, and freedom type South African, armed with the information, could have done much better at mitigating and reducing the risk by choosing to take that risk on ourselves and make decisions about our health, as opposed to thinking some politician in Pretoria can do that for us. Again, that's my view, right? But you have a view too. And with that being said, pop it in the comments, right? Whether you watch this on Twitter, Facebook, or on YouTube, leave me a comment. What did you think about this debate? What do you think about the topic? What's your view on this particular issue? Will you be getting the vaccine? Won't you be getting the vaccine? I myself will not be getting the vaccine. I've already had COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. Check out vlog 70 on my channel, where I posted the results of the antibody test that I did. And unless I'm shown a need, maybe the waning of my natural immunity, then I might consider taking an actual vaccine. So that's just my decision. But this is the power of the individual. We should be left to make decisions about the amount of risk we're willing to take ourselves. That's my view. What's your view? Tell me, and I'll be super interested to hear. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the BDL Show. A bit longer than usual. BDL shows are usually around 30 minutes, but I felt it was important to have this debate. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on Sunday for Liberty and Friends as we wrap up the news week that is still very much underway. Looking forward to seeing you for that. Once again, a big thank you to my guests and a big thank you to you. Good night, Ulalegache, and I'll see you on Sunday for Liberty and Friends. A reminder, therefore, as we end the show, never trust a commie.